I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Luis Alberto Urrea is one of my favorites. I'm so delighted he's here. And you guys, he is also the author of our next BNN Book Club pick. Goodnight, Irene is a slight departure. You may know him, obviously, from the Pulitzer finalist, The Devil's Highway, which is narrative nonfiction. And then also his last novel, which was 2018, The House of the Broken Angels. It's been a minute since that last book, and I'm so delighted to see you. But we are going spoiler-free in this conversation, obviously. If you want the spoilers, you can join us in July for the BNN Book Club event. But in the meantime, we are going to go hang out with a couple of women called Irene and Dorothy. I want to start with the three women who made this book possible. Your wife, Cindy, your mother, Phyllis, and your mother, Phyllis's friend, Jill. Can we start there, and then we'll get into Goodnight, Irene?
Okay. Yeah, Cindy and I work in partnership.
Mm-hmm.
We're taking the most insane book tour probably of my career this summer. And we bought a beautiful vehicle because we're going to drive it. It's going to be our Clubmobile tour. We were talking one night, and we were talking about my mom. And I said, well, she was a donut dolly. And Cindy said, donut dolly, what's that? And I said, no, the donut dollies in World War II. And she said, what are you talking about? And I said, these women who drove trucks into combat and made coffee and donuts for the troops, sometimes under fire. And she said, what? And I thought, wait, everybody doesn't know about this?
I didn't until your book. And I had no idea.
I had no idea. I thought everybody, but isn't that the way, I was born in Mexico. I think everybody was born in Mexico. I think everybody has a Mexican grandma, and I'm always shocked that they don't. I think the greatest sin we all commit is taking our moms for granted.
Yeah.
It's just mom. And, if I had been able to step back growing up and say, wait, my mom was actually a certified war hero?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
So in some ways it's a way to make amends to that lapse that we all commit, but also to honor these women who are a bit forgotten.
Donut dollies. I have to say, the first time I saw that in the book, I was just like, dollies, really?
I know. They didn't, I can't speak for everybody. Certainly Jill, who we will talk about, she didn't cotton to that business at all. And a lot of the women would say, don't call me Dolly.
Yeah.
And she does that throughout the novel. Don't call me Dolly. In fact, we have buttons that say, don't call me Dolly. It's a little theme in the book that they, Clubmobile women was just too much to say. And we always have a slang thing, but they didn't see themselves as dollies, certainly. I'm sure some did.
Jim Harrison, who I love as a writer, had a hand in bringing this book to the world too.
Yes, he did.
Can we talk about Jim for 2 seconds? Because you and Jim share a lot of that sort of, here's this big life, and here are all the senses and the smells and the food and everything else. It's an excuse to talk about Jim for a second before we go deep into things.
Well, I loved Jim from a distance. We corresponded a few times. After Charles Bowden died, I was asked to be on the commemorative panel at the Tucson Festival of the Books with Jim. And I thought, oh my God, are you kidding me? And he was already up on the podium seated when I got there. And I walked in and he looked up at me and he didn't even say hello. He said, my greatest regret in life is that I didn't blurb The Hummingbird's Daughter. So I thought, dude, wow. And I sat next to him, and he of course, and there was a scholar with us, and we both deferred to Jim Harrison. I mean, you have Zeus on the stage with you, and he went off. It's on C-SPAN. You can find it on C-SPAN. He was saying inappropriate things.
He was being Jim.
Oh yes, he was. And but during the talk, the moderator passed a note down the table to me. I looked at it and it said, can you please shut Jim up? And I just shook my head like this.
Nope.
I thought, who cares what I have to say? the great man is here. And Jim finally ran out of steam and I got some words in. But that evening there was a supper at a fancy restaurant.
Yep.
And the long table, they had saved the end stuff for Jim. Cindy and I were against the wall in a very tight space, and he came in. He was very ill, not far from passing at that time. And he saw us and he squeezed in beside us. So I thought, what a weird blessing, right?
Yep.
And he sat next to me and we were talking a bit. And he said to me, tell me about your brother's death. Mm-hmm. So I'd mentioned it to him. And I thought, okay. So I started telling him about my brother's death and his strange, basically the House of Broken Angels, but his sort of living memorial service that he got to attend like Tom Sawyer did. And Harrison looked up at the ceiling like this the whole time. And this left eye was blind, but I didn't know if he was staring. It was looking kind of sideways at me.
Right.
And I was very nervous because that eye, and I thought maybe he does see me. I don't know what's going on. So I told him the whole story and he listened. And when I was done, he looked down and turned to me and he said, sometimes God hands you a novel, you better write it. And I was just blown away. And of course, Cindy pointed out to me, I've been telling you that for a year or more. Oh, but Jim Harrison, yes, it's just confirmation, dear. So I got to work.
Yeah. And, you have always written deeply personal books. And it may not surface right away, but I mean, you put a lot of you into this is your 19th book. Good night, Irene. It's your 19th book. Brings you into new territory. But I'm going to ask you to set it up just a tiny bit because we open in 1943 with a woman called Irene who is based on your mom. Yeah.
110%.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
My mother's middle name was Irene.
Okay.
Just so people know that they're very close, at least. They're not the same person, but they're awfully close. And all the events in the book, I won't talk about them so that you can be surprised if you are. Yep. They follow chronologically the experiences my mother had.
And there's a lot. Your mother was part of a 2-woman team that drove a 2.5-ton truck to make coffee and donuts for American soldiers at the front. And I had no idea this existed. I had absolutely no idea that the Red Cross had this team of, it was roughly 120 women throughout, I think?
Yeah, at that time, the cadre was 120 women in that group. And she was in group F. The trucks had it had these alphabetical identifiers per grouping of trucks. They were 3 women, but the conceit for the novel is that no third woman could penetrate the friendship, and they had a circulating population. And there were the Clubmobiles, which were essentially the Red Cross's attempt to put a soldiers club on a truck. Eisenhower's great idea. Let's send it mobile. But there were also what they called cinemobiles, which took a portable movie theater they'd set up and show them, Gone with the Wind or whatever, The Wizard of Oz. So that's kind of amazing. Under fire.
It is, but 21st century me is saying teal uniforms.
Yes.
Government issued lipstick in appropriate shades. No one was wearing pants.
They did wear pants.
Oh, good. Okay, that makes me feel a little better. That does make me feel better.
Can you imagine doing that in skirts? No.
No.
They did wear slacks. But yeah, the lipstick had to be a certain, acceptable shade. It couldn't be too seductive.
Right. I don't even know what that means.
I don't know. They just had incredible rules for these women. And one of the things that's interesting to me, they were before they went to training in Washington, D.C. And they were trained all kinds of weird things, including how to play board games and card games and lose every time.
Yeah, right.
They were supposed to lose because the boys had to feel good. And that makes sense. They were morale builders on some level. though there wasn't anything in place to make them feel better. That was one of the motivations for me, because I saw the long-term results of several years of high stress and combat on my mom.
Your mom had PTSD.
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, just from what I've read coming into this conversation that you and I are having, it very much sounds like your mother had PTSD. There's some significant events in the book. And again, we're gonna let readers come to them, because as rough as some of this book is, it's a joy to read. And
Thank you.
The friendship between these women and sort of the way they see the world, and how they're able to reset their lives because of this experience. It is the reality of war is the reality of war. It is not cute. It is, I mean, yes, I was just making fun of lipstick and teal uniforms, but at the same time, that also speaks to us as people. It was the 1940s in the United States. We were not, people wore hats and gloves, and there were expectations of how you carried yourself and all of this kind of thing. And I'm thinking, they're at war in Europe, and somehow people are still making donuts and coffee and playing record players. And
yeah, these women, they were asked to be the girl next door, the cousin or sister, maybe mom, maybe girlfriend, but not official girlfriend, just
right.
to give the boys a sense of normalcy and hope, to keep their spirits up. They delivered mail,
Right.
They carried chewing gum and cigarettes and candy bars. They sometimes, they had these books full of the locations by state and so forth of the other boys, so that guys could keep track of where they were.
Yep.
It was a very interesting thing. And yeah, each of the trucks had a record player in the back, and they had these speakers on top of the truck, and the women were also DJs. They had to, Harry James, whatever, Frank Sinatra.
Mm-hmm.
And once in a while, I think they would even dance. I have a great picture of one of the women dancing with a soldier outside the truck. It was a way to make every soldier and pilot feel hope, I think, a little taste of home.
I want to go back to Miss Jill for a second, your mom's friend, because she was key to this. She was really key to this. I mean, we'll get to the research. You did a ton of research. You and Cindy traveled all over Europe as well. I want to talk about all of that.
Yeah.
But Miss Jill introduced you to an iteration of your mother that you had not met, obviously. I mean, she knew your mother years before you were on the planet.
Yes.
And before your mom had this experience that really fundamentally changed her.
Yeah. Jill and my mom lost track of each other in 1954 as my mother became more and more isolated and shut herself off from the world. And I was born after that, so she didn't even know I existed. And yeah, you marry a newspaper reporter and it's a fountain of research all the time. I want to watch trash TV, but Cindy's researching usually. And we knew about Jill, and there was an event that happened that led me to believe that Jill had died. So I just thought she was. I grew up thinking that this wonderful woman was not with us any longer. In the various research iterations over the many years, Cindy found in my mom's papers a thing Jill had written, and it had an old address label stuck on it. And just on the off chance that somebody was there, Cindy sent a letter. And Miss Jill called immediately the next day. She lived 80 minutes from our house.
Wow.
In Illinois. So you start feeling led almost. That my mother's best friend in the war is here. Yeah. And she was 94 years old, and was pretty sure she may have been among the last 5 or 10 of the women.
Wow.
Still alive. And and she called me Louis. And I got on the phone with her, Miss Jill, and she said, Louis, you must come see me. And I said, yes, ma'am, we're going to come see you. And she said, don't try to wait till I turn 95, if you know what I'm saying. And I thought, oh my God, she's a laugh riot. So we drove down the next day. And this was a turning point in my life. It really was. We knocked on her door. She had a big old apartment in Champaign-Urbana. We're west of Chicago. And she opened the door, this spry but very old woman, and she bade us enter, and we went in, and on the wall, framed portrait of my mom, looking up, elegant in her uniform. And I was staring at it, and Miss Jill said to me, you know, Louis, I drove the truck, but your mother brought the joy. And it felt as though the scales fell off. My mother brought the joy. And we realized thereafter that through almost every single photograph of her that's in her archives she left behind, she's joyous. And she's laughing and she's dancing with soldiers and having a cup in combat with all these soldiers, looking like a badass, you know, with a cup. I thought, that was my mom. Yeah, and I saw those flashes all through my life suddenly of this insouciant creature, you know, this mother who was a New Yorker, a sophisticated New Yorker. You know, she was from Staten Island, which to me could have been, you know, Mowgli's jungle. I didn't know Staten Island from anything. I'd never been anywhere. I'd been to Tijuana, you know, but it was up in the village of Richmond, you know, in the hills where the old revolutionary houses are. They had an antique shop in Manhattan. Her mother, you know, Steinbeck was a client. Albert Einstein was a client. Then they had this family property in Mattituck, Long Island. All things alien to me. But I suddenly saw this person who she must have been. And I saw all the echoes of that person through her older years. It was transformative for me. And, you know, getting to know Jill, there's no novel without Jill, I don't think. We were friends with her until she died at 102. You know, she showed us everything. And she actually had the map she used in the truck with all of her notations. And she had very well organized albums and memorabilia, all the way down to talking to her. We spent hours with her, recorded a lot of it. And we realized it's kind of useless because all you hear is laughter. We just laughed. We laughed for hours with her. But at one point I said, so I'm having a hard time figuring out the interior of the truck. Where did everything go? Because there weren't schematics. And she said, she was looking at the floor. She says, well, my carpet's pert near the same as the inside of the truck, and just started telling me, now the coffee makers were here and here. And I thought, oh my God, I'm crawling around with my notebook, sketching it. You know, those things were incredible. And, you know, I said, was your truck green? She said, no, gray. I said, are you sure? And she said, I drove the truck, I'm sure. So yeah, she certainly dictated a lot of the direction and gave me a new picture of who my mom was and what they did and, you know, what it was like. And the interesting thing was my mother really severely affected by the experience. Miss Jill, world traveler, not messing around, just like Dorothy. And when Jill would get upset, it was a very interesting thing. She'd say, I think I'm going to be sad now. And she'd cover her face. About 90 seconds later, fine. Never saw her shed a tear. She would just, so you can't see her eyes for a moment. And she'd collect herself. She had this incredible, you know, she was like Bruce Lee or something, this control. It was amazing to see. So we took her out to meals, and she still was Dorothy. She was small now, but she had been 6 feet tall in the war.
Right.
My mom was 5'3".
Mm-hmm.
So they, people used to call them Mutt and Jeff, which I thought was lost on this generation. Nobody knows who Mutt and Jeff is. But
it was a comic strip back when
yes,
it was a comic strip. Listening to you talk about Miss Jill too, I can't help but think this is you capturing stories that get lost. This is what you do. You tell stories that might not otherwise get told. I read a lot and I still didn't know about these women. And I'm just also thinking about the way you tell the family story in House of Broken Angels and the fact that it's an American story, right? That we don't have to hyphenate everything, that we just get to be American.
Yeah, sooner or later, I think everybody who comes to the United States probably has to go through some kind of a ritual hazing. It's like getting into a sorority or fraternity, perhaps. It had a weird genesis. Yeah, my brother died.
Right.
And he had been dying quite a long time. And so many wonderful things, believe it or not, happened around his long death. One of them being that I asked, because he called to tell me, I'm very sick, I have cancer. And I didn't know what to do. I was walking along the local river with my daughter on her nature walk.
Right.
I was on the cell phone, and all I could think, and this will date it. I said, what do I do? What do I do? I said, have you heard of the Facebook? La Facebook, ¿qué es eso? I said, no, pues, it's this place where people talk and put up pictures and stuff. And I said, I've noticed that when someone in someone's family is sick, they ask for prayers. Do you want some prayers? Yes. Sí, carnal, you do that for me? I said, sure, yeah. Would you pray for my brother? And somebody came up with a logo called Team Juan with a hummingbird on it, I guess in honor of Hummingbird's daughter, which I thought was so sweet. Mm-hmm. So every week I was able to call him, say, you've got 50 strangers praying for you. Wow, 100, wow, 150, wow. And people would write to me, and they were, from the atheist realist group to Catholic folks to evangelical folks, Buddhists, Wiccans. And this woman wrote to me and said, I and my group, we have decided to go out sky-clad under the full moon, call down the goddess and all this. So I called him. I said, hey, Juan, I got a lovely message from a group of Wiccans. And he said, Wiccans? What is that? And I said, witches? He said, witches? I said, yeah. And they wanted you to know that they're going out sky-clad, And he said, ¿Qué es eso de sky-clad? And I said, well, they're naked. And he blurted, naked witches are praying for me? I said, yeah, isn't that great? And he said, yeah, that's really great. And things like that, they just drift away and they're gone. It's too beautiful to slip away, So the book in some ways wrote itself, though it was a lot of pain, very painful.
Listening to you laugh while you tell that story of your brother, though, there's a lot of laughter in Goodnight, Irene, too.
Yeah.
Which, especially when you're telling a story like this, I'm grateful for, because you gave me a chance to breathe as I was going through the story. I mean, I got very attached to Irene. I got very attached to Dorothy, but I still needed space to breathe. And I think readers, as they go through, will understand that reference. Again, we're not going to spoil any of this for you, but the idea that you need the humor to balance all of the sort of big ideas, the serious ideas, the hard ideas, all of the stuff that is not comfortable, right? Straight up not comfortable.
I'm going to out myself a little bit here, but, earlier in my life, I worked with relief workers in Tijuana, the border and stuff. I was basically a missionary without an actual missionary job. I was just volunteering. But I've understood that storytelling, I think, is a form of prayer. And I think if you're going to ask so much of readers, if you're going to put them in such dire straits, I think you need to care for the reader a little bit. I don't want to pander, But I do know that if I ask you to go to hell for a second, if I have any conscience at all, I will try to lift you back out of the abyss. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah, I do.
even under the volcano, which may be the most depressing book ever written, is really funny if you have a sick sense of humor, drunk humor. That's part of it. Also, my mom's favorite writers, I'm trying to keep in mind that it's a book I was hoping my mother would appreciate. She loved Hemingway, so our little Barnes and Noble secret revelation is the book begins with the word then, not only to suggest, oh, there's a whole story before this,
Mm-hmm.
and now we're in action from the first second, but also
Yep.
Hemingway did it.
Yep.
In A Movable Feast, which is both of our, I think, favorite Hemingway books. I loved it too. And he says, then, blah,
Yep.
blah, blah, blah. So I thought, if Mother's watching from somewhere, she'll get it. I stole a Hemingway trope. So there are all kinds of little things in it. And both Goodnight, Irene and House of Broken Angels were very painful and difficult for me to write.
Right.
So the next book's going to be, semi-farcical to clear the pipes a little bit.
Stretch. Shake it off a little bit. Because
I was going to ask.
Yeah, I was going to ask because, I mean, you've talked about it quite a lot in interviews for Broken Angels, where you've just said, I wanted to make sure I got my family right. And this is family you knew to a certain extent. And this is family and so to pick up someone in a place, that's kind of the ultimate liminal space, right? For a writer, you're sitting there saying, I have no idea who you were, and yet I want to do justice to not only the idea of you, but also my own work, because, as much help as you had from lots of really, really smart women, you still had to sit down at the desk and do the work and create this world and create Irene and Dorothy.
Yeah. And, thank heavens that the books have done okay and we've been able to travel, because without going there
right
over and over again, several trips to London, and we went to Paris, but we drove all over England, went to the bomber base that's in the book. We drove all the way all through Germany, retracing their journey. Went to Buchenwald, all of it. And those things are priceless to reconnect and to feel it. But also, little things that we finally, it's amazing it didn't occur to me before, but we finally went to Staten Island. And, it wasn't the Emerald City, great bagels, I'll tell you that. But then we found Richmond Village, and we found where my grandmother's house had been, where my mom grew up. And we went to the church a block away that she went to, and across the street, the grammar school my mom attended. Suddenly, I was in my mother's girlhood, and all those little stories she would tell came back. We walked down her hill. We went to the little creek in the woods where she would read. And, she became clearer and clearer to me as we went. And when we were at the air base in Glatton, and this is something that moves me so much. I have pictures of her in her thatch roofed house from the 15th century where they were bivouacked, and pictures of the pub, and pictures of the churchyard, and pictures of a neighbor's house. They're still there. All of it is still there. And I was able to take my daughter and point up to the window and say, that's your grandmother's bedroom. How crazy. And go down to the air base in Connington. They named it Glatton to keep it simple for the pilots. The landing strip for the B-17s is still there. And there's so many eccentric things that are so much my mom's sense of humor. For example, they built this base, but there was a recalcitrant farmer who would not sell his property. So they had to build the base as a giant triangle surrounding his farm. And this old codger would go ahead driving his old tractor as the bombers were taking off around him. It's still there, you know. And my mom would ride a bicycle when they'd taken off, run all, you know, get exercise riding her bicycle. There's one hangar left. And the manager of the air base, this lovely man named Jeff, and they call it the Fireball Squadron because they love that cinnamon whiskey Fireball drink. So we went out and drank a toast to the boys, and you know, and he says to my daughter and me, "Would you like to walk the runway?" We said, "Yeah, Jeff, of course." So we have this long walk, and he starts telling stuff that's in his heart. You know, some of their ghosts are still here. I said, "They are?" And he said, "Oh, yes, they're quite helpful, you know." I said, "What do you mean they're helpful?" He says, "Well, if we're repairing a plane and we can't reach the toolbox will slide toward us." I was like, he may be lying, but that's so good.
It's a great story. Take the story.
And the capper of this is he stepped off into the weeds and he dug around and he pulled up this triangular chunk of tarmac. They said, "This is from the original. This is the original tarmac." And he handed it to me. He said, "You should take this because your mom might have stood on it." You know, you're like, oh man, wow. But that was the miracle of this. Everywhere we went, there was some fantastic, almost fictional thing, you know, that happened.
Did you get something from writing this book that you didn't necessarily expect?
Yeah, I think so. Anyone who's lost their parents, you know, have regrets. I have terrible regrets. I couldn't save my mom.
Right.
You know, I tried so many ways and so many things brought her joy, but not least of which was after complete isolation for my entire life. I ended up living on the East Coast in Massachusetts, and I got to go meet her Aunt Eva in Mattituck and hang out in their house, which is in the book, and see the bedroom my mom slept in. And they had her encyclopedia still from 1919 or something. And I was able to fly my mother to the East Coast. And for the first time in however many years it had been since before the war, she talked to her aunt on the phone from my apartment. I kind of made her do it. She didn't want to. And then I took her down to Connecticut and put her on the ferry. And she reunited with her terrible cousins and her auntie, and she lived with them for a while. So, you know, that was good. So you always want to try to ease people's pain even after they're gone. I think, I hope. Isn't that love? I think it is.
I think it is, but I think it's also what you do across your books, because you always walk in. I mean, compassion is something that sort of reverberates out of your work. It's something I don't think you can sit down until you have figured out. I mean, even times when you've gone in thinking, well, the story's going this way, and then you meet someone and you're like, oh, the story is not going. Oh.
Right.
You can't write without being a compassionate person. You do have to leave some ideas at the door sometimes, but I think you have to actually somehow like people in order to be able to do this.
Yeah, I think that may be true. You know, here's a good example for you.
Yeah.
When I'm working on the Devil's Highway.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, obviously, I've been an advocate for migrants and blah, 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 and I don't like bullies and blah. And I was just convinced that the Border Patrol were awful.
Right.
And I didn't want to take the it was an assigned book. I didn't choose it.
Right.
And,
I remember.
And because I didn't want to deal with those guys. And I think they knew it. And they put me through some ritual hazing. And I thought, oh my God, they're monsters. But it suddenly hit me that, you know, they're under siege 24/7. They're pretty conservative. And here comes some freaking Mexican named hippie looking guy. And you know, when I went to see them, I think I thought I was Bono, you know, from YouTube. I had hair, I had a hoop earring, you know, yeah, man. And they just were like, okay, what's this thing? And I was thinking that they would be the villains of the story. And the supervisory agent who took me under his wing, Kenny Smith, I always honor him. And the sheriff of Yuma, Sheriff Ogden. These are some tough hombres. And they took me in, and Kenny showed me his soul. And he told me, I'm very close to retiring, and I don't care what people think. I'll talk to you. And I thought, well, that's a practical solution. But he turned out to be this wonderful guy. I loved him to death. In fact, we were standing on the Devil's Highway, and he was confessing his life story to me. And this will probably make your point, but I could not help myself. I kept looking at him, and my heart is melting. Mm-hmm. And I finally blurt, Kenny, I love you, man. And he never looked at me. He just said, I kind of like you too, buddy. Mm-hmm. Cowboy. And I thought, wow. So how much am I losing through my own prejudice? Right? So it's time for me to always try to check myself if I'm going to write something. And the other thing, you probably know this, but the one who discovered me and started my writing life was, Ursula Le Guin. And she was formidable. Yes. I mean, she was astonishing, kind, wise, tough. She used to call herself your tia Osita, your aunt little bear. And she was a bear. I mean, she would awesome. she would gnaw you to the bone if you were messing up. And she's the one. I was 21, maybe 22 when we crossed paths. And I was in college still, and she used to call me Luisito, little Luis. Back then, she used to smoke a pipe.
Okay.
Luisito, it's time for us to be feminists. I said, feminist? He said, you're going to be a feminist now. I said, wow, okay, what do I do? You're going to take women's literature courses from now on. Mm-hmm. So I was reading Olive Schreiner and, Doris Lessing and all this stuff. She steered the craft. In fact, that's one of her books on writing, Steering the Craft. And she did. She just kept pointing me in directions. And, so I feel answerable to her too. I just feel like I have a really wonderful tribe of elders. And they delineated a kind of a path, I think, that I needed to follow.
But isn't part of writing for you also slightly instinctive? That you just sort of know where you need to go, and you're very good with being uncomfortable in ways that not everyone is. And you don't hold back. And that's part of the fun of reading you, because there are moments in Goodnight, Irene. And again, I'm not going to spoil it, but where I'm just thinking, okay, this can't be fun for you on the page, but okay, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to keep going. And, I am treading lightly because we are talking about your mom.
Well, we're talking about a character inspired by my mom.
Yeah, but...
Yeah, but just between us,
Sorry, I'm having a moment.
To try to alleviate that, you will see Dorothy, or actually Jill Pitts,
yes,
and my mom Phyllis in their own truck. So it's sort of like weird meta stuff that here are the fictional versions, and there go the real gal. And they're talking to each other on the radio and so forth, because I wanted to have that bit of space between Mom and Irene, though Irene is definitely informed by my mom's experiences. And I also realized that she needed to have a romance. And I just could not get myself to write sex scenes about my mom. No way. And Cindy would tell me, just do it. I said, no, I can't do it. But, Irene, I could do it.
Yeah.
And this also was a gift from Jill. I've told this story elsewhere, but I Jill had pictures of my mother with some smarmy bastard in swim trunks at the Riviera hugging on her, and they were a very handsome couple. She looked like a little movie star all the time.
Yeah.
Little hairdo, and here he is all hugged up on her. And I said, Jill, who is this guy? And she looked at the picture and she said, oh, that's Jake. And I was like, Jake, who's Jake? I was outraged. And she said to me, Louis, it was a war. We all had men. I was like, you all had men? What? But it opened so much too that, of course, and this happened after Jill died with Cindy. The university made a special, Jill Pitts wing with all of her stuff. But they allowed us to spend the day, just the two of us, just our last journey through this. And we were looking at the mail that Jill got, and there was somebody who wrote and said, is Phyllis still with that hotshot pilot, Jake? And it felt like another message from beyond, because the guy in the novel is a hotshot pilot. We didn't know this guy, Jake, was a pilot. So it was just over and over again, there were these weird reality loops that we fell into as we traveled. And, so I thought, okay, that's good. That works.
It's just a nod from the universe, yeah.
Yeah, so Jake became the handyman.
Do you miss these women?
Yeah.
The book is done for you?
I do, especially, the heroic and delightful version of my mom that I saw glimpses of. I wish she were here. She'd be so happy right now, just that life turned out. Yeah. That I have a happy family, kids, a career she'd be happy about. And we really miss Jill. She was a wonderful addition to our family. So yeah, I miss them. I miss so many things. I find myself missing George Patton because they loved him. He loved donut dollies.
Okay.
He loved donut dollies. And he was, their hero. He protected them in a lot of ways. Yeah. It turns out now, stories come out that he might have had a relationship with a donut dolly. Wow. Not one of mine, damn it. But so that's just wonderful stuff. I miss Europe too. It's possible that without my mom's legacy, I wouldn't have known as much of Europe as I got to know as we traveled everywhere. And I was interested also, in the Danish roots of the Dunford clan. So we stayed in Copenhagen, just wanted to find out if things were right.
But isn't some of that, are things right? Isn't that sort of also, you still have license to make stuff up? I mean, you're not writing a strict history or a strict biography. I mean,
no,
to play a little bit too. And I think that shows quite a lot in the book, that there's a swing to the prose on the page where you're kind of like, well, no, then it's not just Benny Goodman. I mean, yes, there is a soundtrack to this book. Don't misunderstand me, but there is absolutely a swing to the prose, and it's kind of a delight. And again, we're talking about World War II. This is not, peaches and cream every minute, but there are some moments in this book that are just, they're wonderful. They're absolutely wonderful. And there is so much to talk about. But before I let you go, I have one question.
Okay.
Do you still really want to be Mark Twain? Is that still, your wife has mentioned that a couple of times throughout sort of the course of your career. And I love this idea, but it does come back to your mom, because your mom would sort of grab you aside and read lots of Mark Twain to you. And I love the image, but I'm wondering if that's still sort of sitting, because I mean, you also talk about Tom McGuane a lot, and I love Tom McGuane.
Tom McGuane, are you kidding? Is one person that I'm scared to meet just because I've had him on a pedestal so long is McGuane. But
Yeah.
we've crossed paths. We were having parallel book tours, and I'd leave him a signed book, and he'd leave me a signed book. I never saw him, and he once sent me a postcard. Apropos of what, I don't know, but he said even Richard Nixon knew that life is basically 99 rounds. Tom, I thought, what?
I'm sorry, I don't even know what that means.
But it's so perfectly McGuane.
It is. It totally is.
This is the best. Anyway, Mark Twain, he was my mother began with Dickens, reading me Dickens.
Right.
Which was very interesting. But when she read me Tom Sawyer, I lost my mind. I thought, what the heck is that? And of course, Becky Thatcher, my first little romantic fixation. And then she followed it with Kipling, the Jungle Books. My mom was smart. She hypnotized me into this stuff. So Mark Twain over and over again crops up. I love him. I have a lot of his books. Every once in a while, we find, one of the old ones and buy it because it's amazing. Someday, I would love to have his autograph just in a frame on a wall somewhere. I happen to have, through friends, the Johnny Cash autograph.
Oh, wow.
But it feels like a blessing, It's like, hey, Johnny, I'm going to get to work now. But, about the swing, I don't know. I think it's internal.
Yeah.
I probably wrote much of Irene, to 9 Inch Nails or something. I'm always listening to music. Always.
I love that. Can I ask what the next thing might be? Have you started thinking about it beyond it just needs to be not about your family, or have you started sort of playing with bigger ideas?
Yeah. It's one of my relief books, after Devil's Highway and Hummingbird's Daughter, I did Into the Beautiful North just for fun. So these books have been very heavy. So the next one, I'll tell you the title. It's called The Zebras of Tijuana.
Okay.
And it's about the old practice they have in Tijuana of painting donkeys to look like zebras and then taking tourist pictures with them. And I thought, if that isn't the perfect definition of Tijuana, I don't know what is. So it's a picaresque faux history of some folks getting in all kinds of crazy trouble because of the fake zebras that they call zonkies.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did not know zonky was a...
there's always something to learn. And I'm bringing back a Tomiko from Into the Beautiful North.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I like him a lot. I don't have it with me, but I would show you. A fan made me his fighting stick. It's far away, but so I have a 6-foot long bamboo with a shifter knob in the end, like in the novel, just in case it comes in handy.
You never know. You never. Is that still in development? By the way, that was in development for series at some point, and then I don't.
It's ebb and flow. Flow. A lot of those border projects sort of faded away, and now Irene, I think, maybe waking things up. So we'll see. You stay philosophical. I'm here for the typing. The rest of it is just icing.
I'm here for you to type as well, but I do think that there's an audience who would like to see Goodnight Irene on the screen. It is very cinematic. I think you have this very, and again, I think just a lot of this stuff is internal for you, but your sense of timing on the page and the narrative tension, it's just kind of like, okay, right when I think I'm about to completely lose my mind, you give me a little bit of a break.
Oh.
And it's it's not easy to do. You make it look easy, but it's not easy to do.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I want to write something that I would want to read.
Yeah.
And that may be, why Twain and McGuane blow me away, because they have a warmth and a humanity and a sense of humor, sometimes quite dark, but a sense of humor that's always right there in and around the prose they're writing. And don't get me wrong, I'm a fool for Cormac McCarthy too. I read Blood Meridian many times, and there can't be a darker book ever. But the antidote is Larry McMurtry. All the guys with an MC in their name. But Larry McMurtry did that too. And I've read Lonesome Dove so many times. So I think I just gravitate toward that kind of maybe worldview. Garcia Marquez was funny as heck.
Yeah.
So
funny's good. Let's keep doing funny. We should keep doing funny. Yeah. Can we just keep doing more funny?
Let's do it.
All right. That sounds like a plan. Luis, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. And again, if you're joining us for the book club, that's July 11th. And there'll be details on Eventbrite and bn.com. But that's when we'll do all the spoilers, because I have questions that I sat on specifically so that we didn't wreck it for readers, because this is coming out right as you pub. So we just want to make sure that everyone else can have this fabulous experience, because really, Goodnight, Irene is pretty spectacular, my friend.
Thank you so much.
It is a pretty spectacular book. So thank you again. It's out now, and we'll see you when we see you.
I'm Jenna Seery. I'm a bookseller and the associate producer of Poured Over, and I am joined today by Rita Chang-Eppig, the author of her incredible debut novel, Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea. This one's going to bowl you over. You're not going to want to miss it. There are pirates. There's political intrigue. There's a little bit of romance. There's something for everyone. Rita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenna.
I think since this is a debut novel and really such an interesting premise, I'd love to have you start by just setting up a little bit about the book for us.
Yeah, so this book is actually based on a life of a real life, you might call her pirate queen, who lived in China during the late 1700s, early 1800s. And she was primarily operating in the region that we now think of as Hong Kong and Macau. And she started from very humble origins. Some records indicate that she was the child of a fisherman, so she didn't come from wealth. Some records indicate that she was kidnapped by pirates, abducted by pirates when she was pretty young, and sold to what back then they euphemistically called flower boats. So basically what we these days might call brothels. While she was there, she caught the attention of, you could call him a pirate king. He was the commander of one of the largest fleets operating in the area at the time. They got married, and then she took over basically command of his, which some people find very surprising. Like, like he just handed control over half the fleet over to her. But I think it was because she had really proven herself to be an impressive strategist to him. And then after he died, she immediately married his second in command, because back then because of inheritance laws, she couldn't inherit the fleet herself. So this book is basically, it's a fictional retelling of her life with some, let's call them speculative elements.
And it moves so quickly, it moves so well. From the first page, you are immersed in this world that is such a deep and interesting set of circumstances for these characters. My question that I think maybe a lot of people would wonder as well is, why pirates? Why this story? How did it come to you? Because it is certainly something that we don't see every day depicted in literature, and it is a little bit more of these fantastical elements that weave in as well. So I just want to know how this all came to be and came to you.
Yeah, why pirates was a question I asked myself a lot when I was writing it. Like, of all the things I could have written about, why am I torturing myself over this thing? This short answer is because I've been fascinated by by pirate life in general since I was a kid, but specifically by this historical figure, because I'd heard stories about her growing up. I was born and raised in Taiwan. But the reason I really decided to turn this into a novel instead of just a passing, or instead of a personal interest or hobby, is that this was around the time of the 2016 election. And, obviously there was a lot of talk about women in leadership positions. So that got me thinking about women who were leaders throughout history. But because of my own writing style and because of my personality, I was always more interested in the women leaders who were these were not the ideal role models. If you know what I'm saying, like this is not somebody that you point your young daughter to and say like, when you grow up, you should be like this was a complicated woman who did a lot of really heinous things because she was a pirate. She wasn't a humanitarian. That's what I was interested in. And I thought, okay, let me see if I can try to tackle her story from a more human angle, because I had people were talking about her, but I think there was a way in which she was getting reduced to an archetype or getting reduced to like a trope, it was turning a little bit into like a hashtag girl boss type of thing in discourse. And so I was like, okay, let's see what it would be like if I tried to tell her story as a human woman, as a human being. So that's what led to it.
And you really created a character that, yes, there's some morally gray aspects. There's some part, maybe more than a little bit. There's definitely moments where you're reading going, eyes wide, staring at the page like, oh, this is what's really happening right now. And you just chug along with it. But at the same time, like you said, the characters are so human and relatable because it feels so incredibly well researched. And that's something that I think when I was reading struck me the most, is the amount of information and knowledge that is imparted through all of this. I'd love to talk with you a little bit about sort of your research process for this, because it must have been extensive.
It was. But, because I was kind of a nerd about pirates to begin with, it makes it easier when you're already a nerd. But I started with more just archival research. So I read a lot of dissertations are wonderful. I keep telling people this. Dissertations are wonderful resources if you have access to a university library subscription, because somewhere someone has written a dissertation about this exact topic that you're writing about. Like there are many PhDs who've written collectively many books. I started with with just reading a lot of these dissertations about what the society was like during Qing Dynasty China around that period of time. I was reading a lot about political unrest, and that it was a period in which there were a lot of rebellions because people were really unhappy with some of the wealth disparity and social problems that the emperor at the time just was not dealing with. And obviously I also read books and dissertations about this particular pirate fleet and this particular woman within and her role within the fleet. After I sort of laid all of that groundwork, and those books gave me a really good sense of the context and what might motivate these characters that I'm writing about, I got to do some of the fun experiential research. So I flew back to Taiwan. I was actually living in Taiwan for about almost a year. And because of Taiwan's proximity to the southeastern coast of China, right, like that the thin strait that separates the two, a lot of the immigrants, the waves of immigrants that came over from Fujian to Taiwan, they brought over a lot of like their maritime culture. They brought over a lot of their folklore and spiritual traditions. And so it was really wonderful to be in Taiwan. There's literally a life-size replica of a junk ship from hundreds of years ago that you can climb aboard and you can poke your head into things and measure things with your arms and go to temples and see what are some of the remnants of this culture that we can still find today, and then kind of using that to backward project into the 1800s.
And your writing makes this all feel so colorful and rich. It never felt, even though there are so many things that I had to Google in order to really fully wrap my mind around, I went on some really intense Google rabbit hole searching through this because there were so many things that were unfamiliar to me. But it never felt like it was just dumping information towards me. It was very synthesized into the story. And as I was going through, I would Google and then I would go back and read a page and be like, oh, that makes so much more sense. And I was able to get such a better picture of what I was looking at. And I'm sure that as you were researching and getting to do those more experiential things as well, that really helped put those pieces together.
Yeah, it did. And I mean, I should say, I don't deserve all the credit, right? My editor deserves a lion's share of the credit for this, because there were definitely moments in the novel where I would, I would like write like 3 paragraphs about the types of weapons that they use, and my editor would come back to me and be like, I don't think we need all this we don't need this information dump here. So thank you for saying that. And also my editor, shout out to her.
It's great. I mean, sometimes there are, other nerdy people reading the books that are like, I could do with 3 more paragraphs on the weapons, but I understand from a commercial standpoint that maybe there's some trimming that needs to happen. But I know that as I was reading it, that was something that was so interesting about this book. And if people can read, these fantasy novels and learn all this magic crafting out there for other not real worlds, sometimes we have to be able to do that with things from our own world as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such a good point, right? That for readers of science fiction and fantasy, very often it's expected for readers to kind of do a certain amount of self-educating or sort of catching up in terms of what the components of the world entail. And so I don't think this book is as intensive in terms of how much you need to, quickly pick up in order to follow the plot. But at the same time, I do understand that there are going to be elements that might be a little bit strange.
But it's also enriching. I mean, I think that's why so many of us come to literature that is different than experiences that we know, and especially with something like this that is so historical and yet is often so overshadowed by other aspects that were happening around the same time. It's reassuring that literature can do that. It can offer us these portals into something that we wouldn't necessarily encounter going through history books.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can tell you for a fact, I have always been one of those people. If you ask me, would I rather learn something through reading a history book, or would I rather learn something through fiction, hands down, and so, yeah, I agree. I think one of the beautiful parts, of literature is that you are introduced to things that you might not otherwise have been introduced to, and you grow in the process of reading more things.
Definitely. One of my favorite pieces, sort of that I ended up on one of my many rabbit holes on in this, is the mythology that is woven in, this folklore, this piece that is sort of both within Sekyung, our main character's experience, but also with sort of these vignette chapters in between of folklore themselves that really expanded this story. How did the mythology sort of present itself as you were weaving this story together?
So the sea goddess who is frequently mentioned in the novel, for folks who haven't read it yet, is Mazu, who's got, I don't know the exact number, but many, many worshippers throughout Taiwan and China and other parts. Like, I think there are worshippers in Japan and elsewhere. One of the facts that I came across while I was doing my research was that these pirates were, perhaps surprisingly, perhaps unsurprisingly, incredibly religious often, right? Like, you would think like a bunch of people who make their living robbing and stealing from people, but actually they very often were quite religious. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about the fact that, if you live on the sea and your life and everything that you own can be destroyed in a single instant by like one bad storm, like you kind of need to have a certain element of respect for. So Mazu is the sea goddess who is mentioned many times in the book. And so once I've learned that these pirates were actually very often quite devoted to Mazu, it helped me think about the elements of their life that weren't directly related, the aspects of their life that weren't directly related to robbing people and killing people. And the other really interesting thing about the name Mazu in Chinese, it translates to maternal ancestor. So there's a maternal element to it as well. Like, people think of her as a mother figure. And so themes of motherhood, because they're also quite prominent in the novel, I was like, okay, this is a really nice marriage between the spiritual themes and the themes of motherhood.
Definitely. It's definitely a feminine novel. And I don't mean that in any sort of like chick lit, whatever that means, kind of way, but there is such a strong female energy between Sekyung, between sort of her counterparts that she's dealing with, sometimes adversarially, sometimes in a more, friendly manner. And I think in a historical fiction sense, so often if you have main female characters in historical fiction, it's like a romance book with, like a flowery cover, and those serve their place as well. And there's so many interesting titles in that genre as well. But this is such a strong story of adventure and overcoming. I think in the realm of historical fiction, this sort of sits in a very different place than so many other books.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I mean, one of the things I really wanted to explore was, so again, another fact that came up in research was that these fleets were actually surprised. I mean, they definitely weren't, like 50% women, but there were a surprising number of women who belonged to these fleets. And one of the things that I really wanted to explore was, how do women of various backgrounds, various ages, various personalities, how did they survive and how did they thrive within a lifestyle that is so often associated with the masculine? Like how do they befriend one another? How do they support one another? Right, female friendship in these overwhelmingly masculine environments was definitely something that I wanted to explore. So I don't think of it as an insult at all. When you say it's a very feminine book, that was one of my goals going into it. I wanted this story to be focused on the women in these fleets.
And our main character is such an incredible ups and downs. I mean, there's times where you are so like on board with what she's doing and you just want nothing but success for her. And you're like, you can do this. Like, this is going to be. And then there are so many moments where you're like, oh no, what is she doing? What is happening? Why would you make that choice? But you also kind of know why she makes every choice that she makes. How did you find her voice? How, taking this character that is a real historical figure, but has a lot of competing information out there about her life, how did you find your version of this incredible woman?
That's a really good question. I mean, I knew off the bat that I didn't want her to be a completely relatable. I mean, I wanted her to be relatable in the sense that I think we've all done like terrible things that we feel bad about. You know what I mean? Like, we can kind of relate to that feeling of like, I really want something and I did something that maybe I'm not entirely proud of to get it. So I wanted her to be relatable in that sense, but she's a hashtag girl boss kind of character. I wanted her to feel complex and human. And so I think one of the things that I really tried to do was there are moments I think that were really in her POV, and we can kind of see why she, or at least I hope that readers can see why she thinks she needs to do the things that she needs to do. And then there are moments where I'm deliberately kind of pulling out. Like I want her behavior, I want her actions to feel a little bit distancing. And somebody asked me recently, why did you start the novel with her as an adult as opposed to her as a child? Because so often with stories that about somebody's life, you start with like childhood and you move onward, right? And I had made a very kind of intentional decision to start with her, not just as an adult, but as the commander of a fleet, because I realized that if we started her as a sort of peasant girl who's like full of like energy and full of like enthusiasm and hope, and that actually would make readers relate to her too much. I don't know if that makes any sense. That I think people will get too close to her too quickly, and then I didn't want people to too easily justify all of the bad things that she was going to do later on. So I kind of start with her as a person who is already making a lot of very morally questionable, let's say, decisions, and then we get more stuff about her childhood. So I mean, I think the voice was about knowing kind of the moments where I wanted to zoom in and knowing the moments I wanted to pull out, and then kind of modulating the voice as I felt like was necessary to create that effect.
I mean, I definitely noted sort of this balance between when we feel close to her and when we have to pull back because the decisions that she's making or the places she finds herself are sort of go beyond what any of us have presumably dealt with. Yeah, hopefully. There's not a lot of, life or death pirating decisions happening out there, but you never know. I think that across the board, you see this growth in her in some ways, but it's not always like the growth we'd imagine. I had kind of written down, like, is this a coming of age, a coming into power story, but in a way that is radically different than anything we'd see now? We follow her. There's definitely a transformation in her thinking and her view of herself that happens as this goes. And I think her voice comes through in so much of that.
Yeah, so there's this, so I worked as a psychologist before I started really focusing on writing. And there's this concept of, it's basically if you tell people to shock a subject during an experiment, like people probably remember this from their Psych 101 class in like college, right? If you tell somebody to like administer a shock, it becomes easier for them to administer more shocks, right? There's a way in which we're all susceptible to this moral slippery slope that can happen in many different situations. And I think there's more than one character change happening in the book, but at this, one of the things I really also did want to explore is what happens when we kind of just like we do one thing that's, to put it very kindly, questionable, and then we do another thing, and then we do another thing, and how do we justify these things to ourselves, right? Like in order for human beings to live, I think we all need to do a certain amount of lying to ourselves, and that's not always a bad thing. Like sometimes lies to ourselves can actually be good for mental health. So like, what are the lies that she needs? What's the rationale that she gives herself in order to justify to herself the stuff that she's doing?
And for her, the stakes are high. They're the highest. There's, between her need to keep her fleet intact and mutiny-free and save herself on that aspect, safeguard her future for her family, for the families of those around her, and the looming threat from the emperor, from the government, and the sort of melding of the colonial and imperial forces off on one side. She is trapped between many things. And those justifications feel in that moment as the utmost important.
It does, yeah, I think the stakes are both personal and they're bigger than her as an individual person. As I mentioned earlier, this was a time of tremendous wealth disparity and suffering in China, right? People were, I read somewhere in one of my sources that if you wanted to buy 1 month's worth of rice, you needed to pay like 6-7 months worth of wages. So like there's no sustainable system here. You can't possibly keep yourself fed if that's the going rate. Most of the people who became pirates back then, they weren't doing this because they wanted to like have adventures at sea. They were doing this because they were starving and their families were starving, And so I think she also did feel this tremendous responsibility to like, these are the people under my employ. They joined so that they could eat and so that their families could eat. I can't really let them down. And yeah, and as you said, there's a way in which that can easily turn into, well, then I have carte blanche to do whatever I feel like doing in order to keep this fleet afloat.
And she certainly makes choices that are as extreme as they come.
Yeah.
But when she's faced with a lot of those instances, there's such an interesting sort of balance between these decisions that she's making, the influence of those around her, and the fact it always comes back to sort of this idea of how much violence is in a woman, I guess. There's so much, that theme really struck me as I kept reading this response from others to her as sort of the undervaluing of what she may choose to do or who she may choose to be because they don't expect that this woman could make these choices and be this person.
I think to this day, there remains this idea, right, that women are naturally kinder, or like we're like, if women were in charge, then there would be no war. I personally find that view a little bit simplistic in the sense that I think that, first of all, I think that there are many different types of women, right? To reduce all women to kind of one category, I think is patently untrue. But also, I think that a lot of it is circumstances. It is true that if you don't have any problems with financial security, food security, housing, there's a way in which, like, when things in your life are lined up right, it can be easy to say, I have no violence in me. When things get bad, that's when we find out what people are capable of. And for her and for many of the other women who were in her fleet, things got bad. I was trying to push back a little bit against this idea that, like, okay, well, women are incapable of violence, or we're incapable of aggression just because of being women.
And your female characters, they sort of run the gamut in different degrees of this. I mean, between Sekyung, her friends from her past, sort of the woman who works with her on the boat and does the money, to the wife of one of the other fleet commanders. There's a lot of these varying levels of moral gray aspects. There's a lot of choices that these women make that sometimes go beyond even what she would do to sort of achieve what they want and what they think they need.
Absolutely. Because again, like, people, including women, exist on a spectrum, right? Like, for every, like, there are people who are incredibly kind and who would rather sacrifice themselves than another person. And there are people who are, more kind of higher up on the psychopath kind of spectrum, who take without guilt, take without regret. I didn't want there to be only one type of woman in this novel.
And for readers of historical fiction, so often it's just refreshing to see multiple female characters in a novel. I think there are so many versions of this story being told where there wouldn't be this interaction between women. I think there are other versions of this story out there that would come with just her facing these male adversaries and would really lack that aspect of interaction between women. But I think that's something that gives this story so much more depth and so much more humanity, because there is a more realistic and relatable set of interactions between these characters.
Thank you. And again, I can't really even take credit for this. Like, I would love to say, like, this is all my own brilliance that I came up with. But, like, the fact of the matter is, so a lot of these characters were real. It's not like I was like, oh, I'm going to write these different types of women characters to, kind of make a point about gender. There's this one character in there, as you mentioned, the one of the leaders of a rival / friendly fleet, depending on how you view them. She seems like a character out of a comic book. She was real. Like, this was a real person. We have historical records about her. So I think a lot of it was just, when I did the research, I was like, these are people who not only were big players in this scene at the time, they would make fascinating characters for a book. So I just put them in there.
And they definitely, the existence of them in history is something that is so interesting, because often I think these stories get overshadowed by, their husbands, presumably. So often I was even reading that so often Sekyung is even referred to only as the wife of so-and-so rather than her own name, which is one of those things in history that I think hits us all pretty deep.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, no, so the two names that she's most commonly known by, in at least not just the English-speaking world, but I think also in many parts of East Asia, Zheng Yisao and Xingxi, they both translate to Zheng's wife. Even though we have her name, like, we have records of her name. So it's not even like her name was, like, lost to history. When I sat down to write this novel, I was like, absolutely not. We're calling her by her name. To me, that seemed a foregone conclusion.
It is those things in history that you don't want to believe they're real. You don't want to believe that this is how this has been passed down. But I think for so many women, it's, of course, you get used to reading that. Oh, again, another example of that sort of erasure, especially in this, where when you research and look at the things, even if you just like go to Wikipedia and look up the things there, her accomplishments, whether good or bad, are extensive, and you wonder, it makes you think of all the other things out there that are just gone from history.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is my firm belief that the version of history that we learn in schools, or the history version that we had passed down to us, that women's contributions were, I don't have a number for you, but, like, it was reduced by at least 50%. Do you know what I mean? Like there's Yeah, I had no proof of this, but it is my firm belief.
Oh, I completely agree. I think it's all the things that with just even like the most cursory bit of research you can discover. And then that makes me think of all the things that are really, truly like gone forever. And then you have to step back and go to books like this and maybe other like revisionist history to sort of calm yourself and remind yourself that we can do better and we can work on it.
I absolutely agree.
As you were finishing up this story and leaving this world, do you find yourself missing these characters at all? Or is it like, I'm glad I got that all out and I got that done, but I am glad I don't have to be a pirate for right now?
As you were asking that question, I had this image of like a group of people on a road trip. Like it's like when you're on the road trip, like you see a lot of sights together, like you take a bunch of cool photos. And also you fought a lot. Do you know what I mean? Like you had our disagreements about like which inn you wanted to stop at overnight. And then at the end of the road trip, you kind of never want to see these people again, because I think I will forever have a soft spot in my heart for these characters, just because they are the first ones that I wrote into a novel, right? But at the same time, I think I was with them for this really cool, road trip / sea voyage. And the sea voyage is over, and I'm ready to embark on a different voyage altogether.
I miss them a little bit reading, which, I'll just go back and start from the beginning again. There were moments where I was like, well, I got to mark that to read that again. So the rest of us will just have to start back over from the beginning. But I always like to round out interviews with my favorite question, which are, what are some of your literary influences? Who do you feel like makes you the reader, writer that you are today?
Yeah, that is always such a difficult question for me to answer, because I feel like my reading came in phases. It came in, pardon the pun, waves. Like there was the first wave when I was in high school and like early college, maybe. That's when I discovered literature with a capital L. Do you know what I mean? Like, because that's when I got introduced to like the big names. And I remember at the time I was reading a lot of Shirley Jackson. I was reading a lot of Angela Carter. And then I was like, oh, I wonder why I am reading mostly European or white American authors. And so I started diversifying my canon, and I started reading a lot of Toni Morrison, a lot of Jhumpa Lahiri, who had just around the time come out with The Interpretive Maladies. So that was like my first phase where I was discovering, capital L literature. And then when I started writing more seriously, like when I kind of said to myself, this is a path that I want to pursue. I was reading, like I've been reading for the past 5 years or so, a lot of Mariana Enriquez, whose two-story collections, Things We Lost in the Fire, and more recently, The Dangers of Smoking Bed. I don't write horror, but the way that she sets the mood, the way that she kind of like describes things, she's just so skilled. So Mariana Enriquez, I've read a lot of Karen Russell. I have read a lot of Tiffany Yannick, who I think plays with form in such interesting ways, and the Japanese author Yoko Ogawa, who has written both amazing novels and short story collection. Jesmyn Ward is another personal favorite. But also like I just sometimes enjoy like big, fun commercial. Like I love Susanna Clarke. Like I read both like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Null and Pure Nessie more recently. I read both of them and like that book is, for people who like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Null, it's like this. Like I read that book in like, I don't know, 3 days because I couldn't put it down. So I'd like to think of myself as having a pretty diverse interest in terms of the types of books I read. And I think those are the people. So they've all influenced me in different ways.
Absolutely. I mean, all those diverse influences have really converged. I can see some of those when you like mention certain things. I'm like, okay, I can maybe see where some of that comes from.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but now I'm really curious because I love like hearing that I've been influenced by somebody.
I think definitely when you mentioned Piranesi, I can definitely feel some of those like tonal pieces that, I mean, obviously there's some like similarities there, but I can feel some of those tonal pieces in there when you mentioned it.
Yeah, Piranesi I think it's really kind of such a wondrous novel because there's this really interesting mystery at the heart of it. Like, what's going on, right? Like, what is this place? But at the same time, there is such a feeling of the numinous or of the spiritual and liminal in that book that I read Piranesi after I finished the first draft of this novel, but like I was like, I want to really try to amp up some of these feelings of the numinous in this novel as well.
I think our readers, anyone who's read Piranesi, I think it will absolutely find so many things in this that they can sort of dig into and like immerse themselves in. But I have to end with every author's least favorite question, which is, what's next? What are you working on to come?
And I will give you the answer that I'm sure everybody hates hearing or getting, which is I'm currently working on a couple of things, and neither is in an advanced enough stage yet that I feel super comfortable talking about it. But I am working on a couple of things, and true to me, they're all kind of like weird things with speculative elements. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I can't wait. I'm on board for whatever. So I'm sure that when we get that information, it's going to be some really great stuff. But Rita Chang-Eppig, thank you so much for joining us today for your incredible book, Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea. It's out now. People can pick it up. They're not going to be disappointed. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. This was great.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Topoff. We've got a special double shot episode today. So I've got two fantastic booksellers who are going to recommend books for Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea, and Goodnight, Irene. Madyson, you are over in the Grove in Los Angeles, and Jamie, you are over in Leawood, Kansas. Madyson, I think I'm going to have you start us off with a recommendation for Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea.
So when I was thinking of books to recommend, Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea has to deal with travel among ships, pirates, all the hullabaloo. We love to see it. So when I was thinking of books to recommend, I kind of wanted to stay with that theme of adventure and kind of, sticking with the pirate theme. So I chose The Girl from Everywhere by Heidi Hellig. It is a duology fantasy. And in this book, you follow a girl named Nyx. She has spent her entire life aboard her father's ship. But what is peculiar and unique about his ship is that it can travel anywhere in the world, any place in time, and any of your favorite stories, as long as there is a map in which the ship can travel upon, which I think is a very unique plot point to this book, because think of how many times we open a book and there is a map in the first beginning pages. So as long as you have that map, the ship is able to travel centuries, myths, stories, all your favorite tales, it can do it. But what the main focus of this book is that her father is so focused and really, really wants to get a hold of a map from 1868 Honolulu. And that is because that is where Nyx's mother is, and he wants the love of his life back. The plot twist is, though, if he goes back to this time, there is a possibility Nyx could disappear forever. So then you kind of see her kind of battle with this feeling and thoughts of, is it worth it to be by my father's side and go back to this time when there is a possibility I could disappear forever? And there's really kind of no swaying her dad away from this path because he is so set on it. So instead you kind of see her come into her own with this ragtag team of people. If you love a good ragtag team, this book has it. You kind of watch her fall in love for the first time on her own and just kind of come into herself. And again, I think the setting is one of the most intriguing parts of this book because it is a ship that can travel anywhere. It kind of also gave me those reminiscent vibes of kind of the ship in Peter Pan, Captain Hook's ship, how it can travel to and from Neverland, but it has access to so many different worlds and avenues. Not necessarily time travel, but still. So I thought this book had a lot of unique aspects that you don't really see in fantasy, because I think it's kind of easy to fall into certain tropes. And while this one has some of the classic tropes, it does have love triangles and you have the comic relief character. It is still, I think, at its plot, that ship that can travel is really, really intriguing, which is why I chose The Girl from Everywhere. That was by Heidi Hellig. So Jamie, why don't you kick it off next?
I'm going to talk about a great book, Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wein. This is a book that has probably been on your TBR list for ages and ages, because it is on many, many, many recommendations and recommended reading lists, and for good reason. This is the signal you've been waiting for, though. So if you haven't picked this one up, it's time to dust it off and move it to the top of the pile. This is a young adult novel. I don't often do as many young adult novels, even though I do read quite a lot of YA. This was just published just over 10 years ago. I think it just had the 10th anniversary. And it's a book where everyone who reads it says, you got to read this book. People press it into each other's hands after they read it. While there are many, many, many adult World War II novels to choose from, many of them not on par with Goodnight Irene, which is exceptional. This one is a YA. And so a World War II book is a much more rare beast in the YA space. This one is a cut above just about all of them. So like Goodnight Irene, the story focuses on two friends, and they are a pilot named Maddie, and her code name is Kitty Hawk, and a spy, Julie, who is codenamed Verity. Their plane has crashed in Nazi-occupied France, and Julie is captured. And we spend the first part of the book with her as she writes her confession, the story of how she got there. And the focus of that confession really begins with her friendship with Maddie and on their common interests in the war effort and in airplanes and flying. And it can all seem a little detailed as you're going through the first portion of the book, but man, oh man, do those details pay off later. So the second half of the book switches up the POV. And now we get everything, this whole story from Maddie's perspective. And like many books with a split POV like this, things take a big turn in the back half of the book, and more connections are revealed to Verity's story. And so it becomes really hard to put the book down as you get to that point. You really want to see how everything is going to line up. The research that Wein has put into bringing, the British war effort in 1943 to life, to the planes, and even the Nazi interrogations and their methods is exceptional. If you love the detail of a historical fiction book and you like a thought-provoking plot, you're going to love this no matter your age. You certainly don't have to be a teenager to enjoy reading about these really brave and clever best friends and the lengths that they will go to protect each other when everything they've ever known has been replaced by war. And so that is, again, Codename Verity by Elizabeth Wein.
Thank you both so much. Great picks as always. But that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Madyson, Jamie, where can we find you?
You can find me at my store at BN Events Grove.
And you can follow my store at BN Leawood KS.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Happy reading. Goodbye.
Happy reading. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.